Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Examine Life podcast, where we take some of life's thorniest questions and deconstruct them in a pragmatic and philosophical way. I am so excited for our guest today, Sarah Chappell, and we're going to be tackling the question, how do you walk away from good money? How's it going, Sarah?
So I'm like jumping right in. I was like, yes, let's get to this question.
Let's do it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, I've been going down. We were reminiscing. Shout out KDVD, Catherine DeVos Divine, for putting us together over an episode of your podcast that I thought you were reading my mind. It was called Burn It Down. Put that in the show notes. Even before we get into, you're a writer, you're a coach, you're a thinker. But before we get into your strategist, but before we get into that, I feel like I have the perfect backdrop to get us going.
Okay.
And so you describe this situation where you're pushing a button on your computer and it's cancel, cancel, cancel. And with every cancel, you are basically throwing out the window one of the golden gooses of entrepreneurship, which is recurring passive. We could talk about what that really means, but recurring income. Tell us about that moment. What were you canceling? Why were you canceling it? Who's getting canceled?
Oh, yeah. That is such a visceral experience. If you have if you've had a business, a side gig, had to refund somebody, ever had to cancel something, ever even like had a job that you've had to quit, right? Or chose to leave, those experiences of saying no, thank you, or just no to money are so challenging. I've been working online for about 7 years, and I ran for almost 4 years a membership site for small business owners who were starting and growing businesses online, or mostly online. And I started to hate it. Absolutely started to hate it, started to resent it. It paid my bills. It paid other people's bills. It was, by, I think, any definition of a small company, successful. Yeah. And after trying a lot of different things, I finally decided to say, throw in the towel. I was like, I'm done. I'm unplugging this. And that did mean that I have to go through and literally press cancel on hundreds of recurring subscriptions of people who kept paying me month after month to access content and a little bit of coaching with me. And you're just literally like, no, I'm going to say goodbye to that money and that money and that money and that money. It was so... Yeah, it was visceral. It was emotional. Yeah. I was like, this is a bad idea. Click, 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 click.
I know. I have goosebumps just thinking. I get that you mentioned Almost Famous in one of your podcast episodes. I'm seeing Dave Chappell's Half Baked, which is probably a little bit before that. And it's like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. I know you weren't saying fuck you to your clients, but then this
feels a little bit like that though, right? You're like, thanks, but no thanks. Don't want your money, don't want to work with you. It's not a fuck you in a rude way, but it feels a little bit funny when people are raising their hands. They're like, no, I want this thing you have. And you're like, actually, you can't have it anymore. Sorry.
Oh, you're giving me goosebumps because I've had two parallels and we can talk about all of them. But the first parallel I had was working on Wall Street. And so I had a 7-figure gig and it was it. That was the thing that was the thing my parents had wanted for me since I was a little kid. Yeah. And at 35 years old, it's like you said, it's a thing that everyone wanted and I got early and I left it. And it just, the feels that gives and the projection that comes with it, it's heavy.
What was that conversation like when you were like, sorry, I'm dipping out. See you later. Thanks for the money.
You, as you were, but UK, in that moment, I was feeling confused. Yeah. I had just gone through an identity earthquake. I was scared financially. It's not like I had this amazing thing lined up, and we should talk about what you may or may not have lined up on the other side. And so all of these, I would say that I was a very leaky bucket right? And so just a lot of insecurities coming out of, every part of my body. So I was a very leaky human in that moment. Every time someone would say something, and it could be something as innocuous as my wife Lisa saying, "Hey, we're going to a school thing tonight. People are going to ask what you do. How do I answer that question?" To the worst thing ever, which was a text that I would get over and over and over and over from people that would say, it would be like, "What are," and ARE is in capital, and then lowercase u, YOU, and then "doing" is in all caps. And then it's like question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation mark. And I'd be like, "Fuck you, leave me alone. I don't know why and so anyway, that was how I felt at that moment. I want to hear how you felt, but tell us first, you had this kind of sweet nectar of recurring revenue, and you rip them, you rip it all off. Did you have something on the other side of it?
No. This is actually the second time that this has happened to me. The first time was in the last time I had a real job. Not that running your own business isn't a real job, but it's also not in some ways. I say as we sit here and record a podcast at 2:00 in the afternoon, or earlier for you. When I left the most corporate-y job I ever had, I was in my late 20s, and it was the same thing where I left and I had no plans. I had no idea what was next. I had a personal crisis. I actually had gotten sober, and I was working in the wine industry. I was the editorial director for this big importer in New York. It was my dream job. It was like everything I could possibly. It was creative. It was fun. Everyone was smart and weird, and like it was a real job, but everyone was weird, so it was great, right? Like I was like, this is great.
Sounds awesome.
I make actual money, and everyone's having fun all the time. And when I left, it was the same thing. That was when I really got like those text messages and the questions, and everyone being like, "So what are we supposed to say you do? Are you okay? Why did you leave your job?" Like, people had so many weird assumptions, and it was so stressful. So this is really the second time that I have done this full pulling the plug thing. And I do think it gets a little bit easier about 10 years later. But no, to answer your question, I had actually literally nothing lined up when I made this decision and started the off ramp, as it were.
Yeah. Wow. It reminds me, wasn't there some TED Talk? I think the name is, I'm going to butcher it, but Sebastian's, it's an alliteration. She sells seashells, Sebastian Sagemeyer or something. And he says you should take it keeps going with the S's, you should take a sabbatical every 7 years.
I like that.
Sebastian Sagemeister says you should take a sabbatical every 7 years. Okay, so you don't have anything lined up. And again, to zoom out for people who are less familiar with the online world, the goal of this recurring revenue is that you don't have to, once you have a client, there's something called the lifetime value, where you just assume that they might stay on for 2 years, 7 years. You get this monthly, dividend check. There's this like really nice thing about this type of thing is that sometimes people forget that they've signed up. There's this other nice thing that sometimes people are they're embarrassed to cancel because they don't want to have to tell you that they're canceling. So you just have this money that's just that's just coming in, and we are in similar-ish online circles. It was called the Holistic Business Academy, was a very established brand in that world. So what is going on? Like, what's leading up to this second, you burn the ships, right? And there's like kind of a school of thought. It's like burn the ships because clean breaks are required to jumpstart something new. And then there's the DJ crossfader. It's like fade one thing out, fade out one track, but keep the bass line going. Fade the next track in so it blurs into this like beautifully cohesive story with no dips in income. What was leading up to the burn the motherfucker down?
I think some of this is my personality type, where my default is to burn it down. When I'm done with something, I am so done. I can't fake it anymore. That's something I've gotten worse at over the years, especially working for myself. I used to be able to fake it. Now I can't. Like, I really am not not fit for society. I can't pretend. So I tried really hard for far longer than I expected to make this work in a way where it worked for me. where I was enjoying my work enough. And, we were making revenue was good, but I was unhappy. So when the time finally came, I felt like I had tried everything and I was like, I am done. So the mindset was really was a big fuck it. I was just like, fuck it. Like, it's not worth it. I also think for me, you often don't, I think, recognize what you've made maybe until you can look at it in the past. And it's with a few months and like having so many people talk to me about what it meant to them and all this stuff. I'm not sure I realized how much it meant to people. I'm not sure I realized what it had done for people. I mean, of course I knew we had testimonials and I know a lot of my clients really intimately, but I think I didn't really have a sense of kind of the scope of impact of it, maybe until after, which made it a little bit easier. But at the same time, when I started that, there were not a lot of people doing what I was doing. Yeah. And now there are a lot of people doing it. So I think part of me was also just like, you know what? I was like, I could like throw a rock and hit 50 other programs that are decent. Like, I'm good. Yeah. I'm done. See you guys later. So I think I was just so over it.
We were over it. I mean, that really in one of your episodes, you said that boredom, it was just so boring. God. Tell me what's boring about making good money?
What is boring about making good money? I was like, I want to hear you talk about this. So it's coming right back at you. I think there's a few things. You alluded to this, but passive income is a myth, right? That doesn't actually exist, especially in the sense that we're talking about generated from a product or a service of some kind. I think the most passive income is probably interest or investments of some kind. Yeah, exactly, right? Like if you're doing a business activity, it is not passive. You always have people emailing, you always have people asking questions. It doesn't matter what the product is. There's always some amount of management. And for what I did, when I do teaching and coaching, even at scale, I still have to show up. And maybe not a lot, but I do. And in that program, I was doing 2 live calls a month. I was answering questions in the community. There's a huge psychic pull, even if you have decent boundaries, when you have hundreds and hundreds of people, to me, in your space, they're there. They're real people. It's not like they bought, I don't know. It's not like they bought some toilet paper from me and I don't know. It's a different thing. So the boredom came from the repetition. So the very thing that I desired, the repetition of revenue, is part of what created the boredom. And having people over the course of 4 years ask me the same questions over and over again. Which, I mean, I have a lot of compassion for people who need those questions answered. But at some point I was like, I don't have to answer these anymore, especially when they're already in your course material. But kind of having the same issues or being able to see somebody post something and be like, I know that 3 weeks down the road, I'm going to get an angry email. And just I knew all the twists and turns. So even the stuff that I found annoying was no longer novel. The work itself was not novel. And I couldn't figure out how to move the ship into a different direction, right? I was like, I tried. I was like, all right, we're going to change the pricing. I'm going to change the messaging. I'm going to try to shift this. I was trying to do all the little widgety things that we can do. Pivot this boat. It's not pivoting if it's a boat. Turning the boat. That I think is what is boring about it is it's not just money. Yeah. And the quality of life, right, is I think why a lot of people want to make money, right? You want to make a certain amount of money so that you aren't worried about things. I was just constantly worried. I was constantly worried about little things that probably were inconsequential, but I couldn't get out from under them. So
do you think that the worry, sorry.
No.
Do you think it was boring? I would think though that if something's boring, you're so good at it's like I could do this in my sleep type thing. So I would feel like worry I would be worried that I'm bored, but not necessarily worried about my output because I'm like, this shit's easy. I
think this is maybe I was like, this is something for my therapist. But I get really stressed when things are easy for me. I think a lot of people do, especially folks who are, I don't like this term high achiever, but sure. Or people who are really intrinsically motivated and ambitious. Things that are easy are often concerning because it's there's either you shouldn't be doing it or you must be doing it wrong. And I think that coupled with the guilt I felt about being bored, like I'm an anxious kind of person, so that kind of stoked it for me. But yeah, like, I hear you, and I wish it was the kind of boredom where it was rote. But instead, I felt guilty about being bored. I felt worried that people could tell that I was bored, that they were like, "Oh, she's checked out." Like, I mean, all these stories in my head. So, yeah.
I could sort of, we talked about briefly about my Wall Street pivot, and I won't bore my listeners to death with that one because I've talked about it every day for 8 straight years. But I'll talk about a more recent pivot. Actually, the one that actually brought us together was a similar-ish kind of online business related pivot. So this episode will come out after this course, but we had this productivity course, Supercharge Your Productivity course. It launched during COVID, and it was just the Goldilocks economy. I think I don't have the exact numbers, but it probably did somewhere between like $1.5 and $2 million of revenue over 2.5 years. And I was so into it, and I loved it at the beginning, and then it crashed, like all online courses when people went back to work. But at the same time, what I realized was like, I don't like this anymore. So it was a very similar feeling. I'm like, this is kind of boring for me, and we should talk about this because the passive income. This was not passive because it was a live course, but one of the things that I really didn't like, which I probably would have benefited from your academy, was the marketing of it. I found it very icky and very manipulative and all that stuff. I bring it up because literally today, so we're running the last one. We have this huge asset, and we still have like severance to pay off. Like we need cash. And so we're just going to run one last one. I'm going to put everything I have into this last one. But I had to promote it this week, and I'm like sitting in front of my keyboard tweeting, and I'm like, I cannot write a single tweet on it. I literally couldn't do it. I went to cheat. I just like Googled, like I searched old tweets of mine on the topic, and I just rewrote them. I just like changed the order basically, and I'm just like, and it goes to your point. I'm like, the people know, whether they know or they, but it's almost like that is the utmost sign to me that this thing has run. If I can't even copy my own old work and change a few letters, that I find that so, like, I would rather try to like write a treatise or something than to try to modify one old tweet that I know will work. And so I can so relate to that, like, look, and similar to you is like, I know you said that people were projecting a lot of things when you shut down Holistic Business Academy. And I project, I'm like, oh shit, we failed, like we had to let people go. The demand that we thought we were going to have plummeted. And I was basically all year, I've been extremely disoriented by all of that. My ego took a massive hit. It was devastating to lay so many people off. And I was just I felt unmoored. I'm like, God, if I couldn't do this thing that I'd done so well and people liked and were I became that person, like who am I? And I was kind of grasping it. And then I'm like, fuck it. We let everyone go except for one person. And we're in complete, to use Pema Chodron, one of my favorite spiritual teachers, we're in complete groundlessness. Like I have no idea what the ground looks like below us, but it's amazing. And amazing things have come out of it. So yes, very relatable on this kind of boredom, like literally cannot move my finger. My finger refuses to move, to know that like, if you moved finger, you might be able to generate like 10 grand of revenue, but finger won't move. Finger ain't having it today.
That is like, I love how specific that example is, because I do think that's such a great indicator. The whole point of so much of this is the rinse and repeat. And I love that. I love repurposing. I love being able to take the thing and tweak it. Like I'm not about I'm not really into time wasting. But you hit a point where that doesn't work, either because you can't do it or the market no longer responds. And those things can often be linked, right? You're kind of like, oh, I can get 10K, but it's going to be painful. Like I got to pull it out of the market. And, as like kind of a sales strategist, there's always more we can do from that lens. We can refresh the messaging. We can blah, 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 blah. But you have to be willing, right? You have to be willing to do it. And I had the same thing where I remember the last big messaging refresh I did that was successful. And I remember being like, I had my finger on the pulse and I was like, oh man, everyone's talking about this thing. This thing is fucking stupid. I was like, I'm mad about it. Often being angry helps me to create good copy. I'm like, no, I'm mad about this. Everyone's obsessed with this strategy. It's a bad strategy and I'm just going to go for it. And, in my opinion, of course. And then like towards the end, I was like, I got nothing. I was like, I got nothing to pull from. What am I going to say to these people? Oh man, social media sucks. Like, who cares? I was like, I don't care. I don't want to hear myself talk about this. Yeah. So I like relate to that so much where you're like, I already even have the content. I just need to zhuzh it. I just need to like, just do something. And I'm like, ugh. And then, it's so hard to then see the impact of that, right? Yeah. We let people go too, and let down many, many, many people.
Yeah.
Or maybe, that's projecting to some extent. Yeah. Shit happens. But I'm like, I made commitments that I could not honor, which I don't love.
Yeah. I'm completely with you on that. And to some extent, I think I have some kind of like, I just have such whiplash from that. I'm like, which is funny because when I was a solo person with a VA, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to scale. And I, very similar to you. It's like, I wanted to give people real healthcare and real benefits and real time off. And like, I did all the shit, like we had rules, like very respectful rules about how to engage on the weekends and, all of that completely asynchronous. Like, I'm really proud of that, how we built that, and it didn't work. Like the revenue didn't, and I don't think that they're correlated directly, but there was this kind of disappointment. And so now I'm kind of like, again, I'm reorienting myself and saying, oh, wow, I couldn't do it that way. But now I'm very much in a, like, let's keep it like narrow and tight and like focus on the creativity. But I want to ask you, this question of boredom, like, should business be boring, right? Because I think that, that's the allure. That's the allure of any career, is you do a career, or not any, many careers and many businesses, you make a widget and you market a widget. And over time, the making of said widget gets easier. So you increase productivity or increase margin, to use more technical jargon. And then the marketing of it gets better because you're repeating, refining, zhuzhing. I love you're the first guest that's ever used zhuzh on this podcast. So thank you. You're zhuzhing it up. And then you have this like beautiful machine and it's so fucking boring. It's so boring. And so like, are you and I just like wired differently that we expect business to satisfy this emotional creative need that's like so non-negotiable that we're willing to literally walk away from tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars? Or is that, do you ever wonder, like, do we have like this fucking blind spot that most people don't have?
I love this question because I think that like a successful business is boring to a point. And like where that point is, I think varies depending on who you are. I think some of my early teachers and people who've been able to maintain large online personality-driven businesses, I think it's really important to note that like these are not actually widgets. It's actually you and actually me. People, right? Like,
you are not a widget, Sarah.
You are not a widget, right?
You're not a gadget.
You are not a widget. Jared Lanier, you are not a widget. Unfortunately, you're not a widget. And a lot of those people, I think you start to see, and I've known, start to have to spend more and more and more time not working, which I know sounds good, but they're spending the time not working in order to be able to show up for the things they have to show up for. And this is kind of like becomes kind of buried in this kind of like self-care, boundaries kind of talk, which isn't necessarily incorrect. But when we start to talk about that quality of life, it's like if you have to take off so much time and have so much team to filter everything through because you have to get all of your needs fulfilled in other ways so you can show up for that 1 hour every week for your clients. I don't know. If you're making millions and millions and millions of dollars, maybe it's worth it, right? There might be a number for people, but you start to notice people pull back in some ways and talk a lot about needing to like recharge and like, it's always in this like kind of like coaching language where you're like, oh, that sounds nice. And I'm like, oh no, you're burnt out. I was like, you're totally burnt out. And you have the team to kind of build it up, which is what I tried to do. And it sounds like you also like, you have the team to build it up, but also the team to buffer. I don't know that a lot of, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put us under the category of charismatic founders, and not like in a culty way, but I do think it's part of it, right? Again, a lot of this is like a personal brand, even when we try for it not to be, it still is. That I do think that it starts to take more and more time to recharge those batteries over time. So because the real problem for me is that you've solved the problem. You know how the path is going to go. So it's no longer engaging. It's no longer interesting. You're no longer driven by that desire to figure it out. So you have to find something else. And I think there are people who figure out how to do that. But, these aren't laundromats. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a different business model where you and I have to be able to show up and do this. Like, this is work, right? This is fun, but this is work. We're showing up, we're showing off, we're stretching our brains, we're focused. I'm like trying to be mindful of how I can like move my head really weird sometimes when I get really into something and talking, and I'm like, no, you're on video, like be good.
Yeah.
So but I think that's it. If you look at people who are really, really established, their, for lack of a term, self-care regimen is massive. And I actually don't know if that's a good thing. Like, I think we look at that as being this like really cool thing. Like, oh, wow, they spend so much time like getting massages and doing ice baths or whatever the thing is we're doing today. Wim Hof, right? And like, is that good though? That they need to spend that much time to get ready to show up for the one event? Because I think that's what it is.
That I had never thought about it that way, because I spend a lot of time on self-care, right? I meditate 40 minutes a day. I run. I sometimes, ever since I'm on a drinking hiatus. And so every time I feel the need to drink, I go for a run, which basically means I end up running every day on top of like whatever I did for exercise. I sleep 8.5, 9 hours. I read sacred texts. I'm like, oh, am I doing that? It's an interesting thing because self-care has become such a non-negotiable in my life. I would defend myself against my own accusation by saying that my guide, my North Star for so many things that I do is what I call aliveness. Some people might call it flow or ease or joy. But for me, it's like aliveness in this kind of like jumping out of your seat in an enthusiastic kind of childlike way. Like when I found the hook for today's podcast of like you hitting the cancel button, I was like, I can't wait to use that one, And I was just like, can this podcast start already? But it's an interesting question of like, well, I guess let me flip it back to you. It's like, how do you know that your self-care is in service, like has been appropriated by, I don't want to use the C word, but like capitalism or like some kind of economic system, or your self-care is intrinsically like nourishing?
Well, I think what you just said was great, right? This aliveness. So last year I got really into bouldering, like indoor bouldering. I am not good.
Brooklyn boulders?
I live further away. I go to a place called Metro Rock in Bushwick, where everyone is very cool. And I was like, I am not cool enough to be here. But I bike over there. It's like a 10-minute bike ride. So I get a nice little warm up, and then I climb for like an hour and a half. And I am not good. And I love it. It is so much fun. It is like definitely that childlike wonder. It's like problem solving. It's so weird. You get to fall. You get to see kids be better than you. Like the little kids come up and like crush it. And you're like, oh my God,
And climbers are just cool people. They're just like fucking
climbers
cool
are
people.
cool. Yeah,
climbers
everyone
are
there
cool.
is so cool. Everyone's like, I don't know. It's such a great mix of intense and chill. I was like, everyone's super intense and also really laid back. And I'm like, yes, like I am less laid back. So I'm like, I'm going to cultivate some of this. But what you're talking about, that like aliveness, of course, there are days I go where I'm like, oh, I want to go, but I don't feel great. Like I used to do powerlifting. Like I'm very comfortable with like, that like, yeah, I have an exercise. I'm going to do it today. Like, even if I'm not like 100%, I don't think that's what that is, but it's like most of the time I'm like, fuck yeah. Like that was so much fun. Even when I don't have a great session, I'll be like, that wasn't a great session, but I'm still loving it. And I think of some of the other things I've done that are less like that. I think about, for example, not a bad thing, but when I'm in a place in my kind of like mental state where I need to go for long walks, not want to, need to. If I don't, I don't think I would actually do this, but I feel like I'm going to punch through a wall, right? Yeah. So I'm like, what is the kind of driver behind it, and how consistently is that the driver? I think might be kind of the question to ask. And I can imagine, I used to have these days where I would do a couple coaching calls, and the night before, if not the morning of, I would already be anxious for no reason.
Yeah.
I've done group coaching for 7 years. I have literally talked to like thousands of people who I've never talked to before and been able to help them. Like I can do that. And I would start to feel so anxious. I'd get nervous. I'd start refreshing things on my screen. And then I'd be like, okay, I need to go for a walk. The walk is not bad, but the thing that's driving that is not a state I want to be on a regular basis. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you're spot on. I think that there's this, it's like this, in meditation circles, they might call it discernment. It's kind of like a very, my daughter has this book, like Fancy Nancy. And so Fancy Nancy comes up with all these like French words. Like, this is escargot. And like, it actually means snail. But discernment would be another one of those, which is like noticing or paying attention. The copywriter in me cringes every time he sees the word discernment. But I think there is this discernment and this kind of these noticing of these, I think they're almost, and this is where the self-care comes in. They're these like tiny shifts. I'll give you an example. I never liked running, and I started running and I was enjoying it. We live right by the beach. So it's like this beautiful, amazing run. And I started running, and then I did something very sneaky after my run. I finished my run and I opened up Apple Notes and I wrote my time. And then the next day I went for a run, and then I opened up Apple Notes and I wrote my time, and it went down. It was faster. I'm like, sweet. And then the third day it went down. And then the fifth day it went up, even though I felt like it had gone down, because I was like, I'm fucking, it's like Rage Against the Machine was playing. Like, I'm crushing it. It's like, so like 40-year-old dad, like Rage Against the Machine and Tool was blaring in my headset and I crushed my run.
Yeah, that's the most dad thing I've ever heard.
And it went up and I felt shitty. I had to zoom out and I said, why are you doing this? It's like, it's so private, right? I'm not like posting these anywhere. It's not on Strava. It's a completely private. No one in the universe gives a fuck about my 4-mile running time. No one, literally no one, not even my wife, especially not my wife. It's not impressive, but you're still doing it. And I just like, it was that little notice when how shitty I felt when it got worse that one time, kind of invalidating that great feeling I had for the 40, it was 44 minutes, 10 seconds that I had leading up to it. And I'm like, and I still actually don't know. I think that I've done a lot of therapy and different types, modalities. Like there's a lot of kind of healing of enoughness and feeling good and feeling whole. And I won't bore my audience. They've heard that story a bazillion times. But I do think that when there's a number, even the most asinine number, like how long did it take you to run 5 miles? It's me reverting back to this. It's like kind of you being anxious prior to this thing that you've done a million times where the stakes are quite low. Like the stakes in my running they're literally zero. The stakes in your coaching are quite low because you've done it before. You have the trust and all of that. So it's like, just to wrap it around, I think that there is this discernment where you're just like, one of my coaches calls it the pebble in their shoe. It's like, ooh, something's in my shoe and I could keep walking the rest of my life without taking this out. And most people do. And I think you and I have just met, but I think you and I are at the point in our lives where we're like, I will not walk another step with a fucking pebble in my shoe, let alone for the rest of my life. But again, I think you need to go through that journey of noticing things, burning bridges, being driven by that nose of curiosity, being repelled by the roteness of everydayness. I don't know. How do you think of this? Like, you strike me as someone who's extremely self-aware. How does the role of discernment kind of factor into your business and your personal life?
Oh, I think it's everything. I'm with you. I'm like, I love the word, and I'm also like, oh yeah, I feel like, like I'm getting in trouble at a Dharma talk. Self-awareness, I think, is something that anyone can cultivate. It's not necessarily easy. It probably depends a lot on how you were raised and how you were rewarded and all sorts of things that you guys can talk about your therapists with. But it's something I've worked really hard on, especially since I stopped drinking, because in order to stop something that is not only physically but also kind of emotionally addictive, you have to start to get to know yourself better and understand why you're doing what you're doing so you can stop. And the process of discernment is often, I think the business was such a good example of that, is figuring out essentially, where am I acting from this place of anxiety, right? Which for me is kind of the not fun devil on the shoulder versus, so many words. I'm like, all my little coachy words like authenticity, alignment. These are not actually things that I say. I never say these, but I'm going to say them right now. But where I'm being really true to myself. And at some point, the anxiety about, for example, closing the product, not the anxiety had flipped, where now I was anxious because I had to keep it going instead of because I wanted to leave it. But yeah, I think that like taking that time for discernment is critical. And I do think under that like kind of self-care, like kind of lens, having the space to do that's really important. You have to make the room for it, because otherwise you just keep doing the same thing basically, or you do the thing that you were told you were supposed to do, or whatever you've internalized about what success looks like, or how spending your time is, what is a worthy use of spending your time, or any of these things. So
wow. So how do you, if you go back to the leaving, like if you're embarking on a new chapter, can you describe the alignment that you're looking for? Because you were misaligned, and so you walk. I always forget. We get so into the new, not the nuance, the texture of the details in this. It's like, but the question's like walking away from something good, and so walking away from good money. Obviously, there was a misalignment there, and we talked about the part that was poorly aligned. How do you move forward into positive or healthy alignment for whatever you do next? Because I think that's the $1 million question for so many people. It's like, how do I align it's like ikigai, right? It's like the thing that makes me money, the unique skill that I have, the thing that the world needs, and I forget the fourth one.
Yeah. I guess I'm working on it, work in progress. I wonder if you have any answers. We'll see what we can pull forward. I think there's a few things. I do think that learning kind of just what you were talking about with the running, learning what it feels like to do something hard in a way that is motivating and exciting and interesting, even when it's challenging, right? So like that kind of that really richly textured challenge, to use that language you just said, coupled with the hard that is from punishment, I think is the first level of discernment. I think we're very good at punishing ourselves, and that kind of that notation you were talking about, right? And like you got that lower number, and it's like, no, I'm bad, like immediately, right? Exactly. You're like, for me, I'm always like, I'm a bad person. I'm going to be dead in a ditch. It's like my brain immediately like sees this image of me like dead on the side of the road in New York City.
Oh my God. You're not the first that has used that analogy. You probably won't be the last.
No, it's very visceral, and I'm immediately like, oh, dead in ditch. Like you fucked it up this time. You are now dead in the ditch. But I'm a very intrinsically motivated person. And so I had to figure out kind of what that felt like again, because I think I had kind of lost it. Money, any kind of reward, but money makes it harder to discern, because money has so many stories, and it also has real tangible benefit in your life. It's really nice to be able to I always joke, but I'm like, we drink a lot of seltzer in my household. We're all sober here. We drink a whole lot of seltzer. And it's like just being able to go to Costco and get all the seltzer that we want, these big cases of seltzer. Like for me, it's like pure abundance. I'm like, yes, this is what I want. But that kind of freedom can also be limiting. So it's hard when money's attached. I think what I started to do were a couple things. I had to relearn what that felt like. And that really did mean, for lack of leaning into my hobbies. I was like, I really had to try to find ambition elsewhere, and big ambition. My current project is I'm working on a novel.
Wow.
For anyone who doesn't know anything about novels, it turns out no one cares about them until they're done, and you can try to market them. Unlike online products where you can beta test it and get paid right away, a novel, not so much if you're a rando. So I like started working on this project and like writing a lot and having so much fun. And it's so hard. It is so hard in all the best ways. It's like everything I've ever learned. I'm like trying to like, I have to like pull together like writing and like experience and memory and like all of this. It's so fascinating. It's so all encompassing. And there's no promise of a reward. Shockingly, selling books is hard. Like, I was like, this is not like, I've got nothing to say this is going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
And just giving myself the space to work on that a bit, I was like, oh, this is what it feels like. This is what it feels like when I'm doing something that is like, that is right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean I can't do something and get paid and have it be right. But I was like, oh, finding that ambition and that scope of ambition elsewhere. I was like, oh, this is the feeling. Because I needed the somatic memory of what it felt like after so many years of like the Sisyphean, like up the hill getting crushed, thing.
Yeah, but then the counter, what someone would say immediately after that, they'd be like, that's awesome. How are you going to make money bouldering and selling a novel?
It's a really great question. I mean, I'm working on that, right? How do you, I was like, be an influencer? Not happening. I did briefly, I was like, man, could I do the YouTube? And then I was like, no, that's not going to happen.
It's brutal.
Brutal. No, and definitely not for those things. I was like, who's going to watch a lot of bouldering videos? Somebody who falls off of V2s. I'm going to be honest. It's going to be very unpopular. I do think that comes back to what you're saying, right? The sensory experience of what it feels like to do something and enjoy it because you like it is worth trying to find again. Yeah. And I do think that finding ambition outside of work is probably healthy, maybe for people like you and me. Yeah. But how to make money? Well, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm still figuring it out. I've been doing a lot of consulting. I've been being really picky about projects. I think one of the benefits of working for myself is that I can go and test things and try them out and get the feedback. So I've been doing a ton of product launches. I've been seeing what's going on right now with people. Oh, wow. Again, sales and marketing strategist, working intimately. And I'm going to do that for a little bit, really, until I see the trend again, until I see the thing. But working on launches, for example, is extremely engaging. There's a huge amount of time pressure, huge amount of financial pressure. It's not my launch, which is great, but it's very mentally engaging. So I have that same experience. I get these moments where I'm like, I love a sales page. I love sales pages. It's my favorite thing to work on. Oh my God.
That's where you and I are going to disagree. I'm like, I hate that thing.
I know. So many people do, but I love it. I don't know why. But when I'm like, oh my God, I get to work on the sales page today. I get to give feedback on it because I do kind of coaching and editing. So I'm looking for those same experiences, but in places that let me test new ideas, right? Where I get to kind of do the exploratory stuff. But I'm not gonna lie, it's hard. It's really hard to sit there and be like, okay, I know what I want this to feel like. How can I map these things together? Yeah. I'm not gonna say I have an answer about that. How about you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was hoping you'd forget to ask, but I think that a few things have happened. I think that there's, with a decent sized audience, legacy products, like there's still drips and drabs of like, I just like woke up the other day and there was like $2,000 of affiliate fees that were just like there because someone's on some annual plan, So I'm like, oh, cool, so that there's dribs and drabs, but they're definitely smaller dribs and smaller drabs, the less effort you put into them. I think it really is like the DJ like crossfading mix where, there's still like we're winding down different programs, but they still make some money. I've done three. I'll tell you what I've done tactically, and then I'll tell you what I've done like more spiritually. Tactically, I've opened up the door a little bit more to one-on-one coaching, which is something that I was always like, no, time for money, bad, not scalable, like, online business, no. But I have an extremely high rate. So, when you trade time for money at a very high rate, it's everyone's trading time for money somehow. So being okay with that. And then it's like finding the right clients that are enjoyable to work with. So doing that, coaching, consulting, I believe that there's something in the kind of in the group coaching land for me where it's not this like cohort-based online course where it's like a transfer of skill, but there is this kind of, it's like part Dharma talk, part accountability, part theory, part, workshop. Like, I think that I have a way to put that together, and I'm kind of like trying different formats on that. And then we get a little bit of sponsor, like our newsletter is 50,000 people. So it's about $5,000 a month of sponsorship revenue through ConvertKit. So it's like, it's real money. So those are kind of like the few things that we're doing. But the thing that I realized was, and it kind of jives with like, I think this is my second walking away. It's like, if I wanted to teach productivity, if I wanted to even teach like newsletters or a lot of kind of online business stuff, I can make good money doing that. I know I have all the pieces. I just don't want to do it. And I think it became very clear to me because people have always said to me, you should write a book. I'm like, okay. But then they say like, you'd have a great book on productivity. And I'm like, that's the last thing the world needs is another book of like, the example of like not being able to write the tweet, like the writing the productivity manuscript, that I'd rather go back to Wall Street. That just sounds like sounds so boring and so mind numbing. And I'm just I've outgrown that. I've moved on from that phase. That was a healthy chunk of my online life, and I've just moved on from that identity. I've moved on from that topic. I don't care anymore. I've internalized a lot of the behaviors. I'm very productive, but I don't care. I don't want to talk about it. And I think what I realized was these containers were really fucking with me because it's like, a lot of coaches, I never really followed this, but they're like, whenever you say I should do this, like there's a big warning sign goes off, like who says who, right? There's a big like, don't say should, right? Again, I'm paraphrasing. And so I should write a productivity book or I should have a podcast. And funny enough, I was so anti-podcast because they're very hard to grow and the economics are not particularly compelling in the early days. But the thing that really bothered me is I didn't want to have like a Tim Ferriss interview style podcast, like where you get the latest author on and you talk about the book and they tell the same story they've told on every single podcast. I have no disrespect to those podcasts. I just don't, again, wrong container for yours truly. And so I was in this phase where the containers were really unattractive to me. And I think people can like, if if you're an engagement manager at McKinsey, you're like, is the container of being a partner that much more exciting than the thing below? So everyone knows the containers because they're very sequential and they're very linear and they're well known. So I rebelled against it. I'm like, I'm not going to do the containers. And so this is how this podcast came up. I'm like, well, wouldn't it be cool to just have interesting conversations that are not the book tour with cool people? Like, I'm down with that. And I made a very strict rule: no prep. I don't want to have I didn't want to have a podcast that required prepping because I didn't want to read someone's book just because they're coming on my podcast. Like, I'd rather read a book I want to read.
Sorry.
So
no, I'm like, yes, 100%.
I know. No, it's just so when I closed the door on containers, known containers, all these new ones opened up. In fact, even in the medium that I was so against, I've been so anti-podcast for years for the reasons I just described. And then you'll relate to this as a writer. Mostly what I read sacred texts for nonfiction, quote unquote nonfiction, and then I read literature for fun. Like, I don't really read a lot of self-improvement. And so I recently read, it's very old, Welcome, A Visit from the Goon Squad, Jennifer Egan.
Oh, yeah.
For those who aren't familiar, it's a very confusing, it's not confusing, the structure is confusing. It's not linear. Like, it looks like it could be a bunch of short stories. It won the Pulitzer. It could be a bunch of different stories, but the characters show up kind of in other vignettes. And there's like random weird stuff. People always say one of the chapters is a PowerPoint presentation that advances the story. And the other, there's like an editorial or some newspaper article. And I was like, that is my friend Steven recommended it to me. He's like, you should write a book like that. That's like weird and doesn't fit the format. I'm like, yeah, but a publisher's not going to give a first time writer the room to write the fucking weirdest book they can write. He's like, well, then don't get it published. Like, you have 50,000 people on your list. Like, start there. And so to those listening, this very long-winded way of saying is that there was a container, there was a script, there was an expectation from society, from peers. And when I challenged the expectation, a lot of doors opened that were very adjacent to that expectation, but much more suited for me. Yes. And I do think that all of those are monetizable. They might take longer. They might be different. They might not be as obvious, but they're like, of course you can probably make more money self-publishing than traditional publishing. And even then you probably could leverage a weird book into a traditional deal if you wanted to, right? Like there's so many different levers. And if you just say like, Kay must write productivity nonfiction book, like that's just one strand.
Yeah. It's
Fuck
funny.
the containers.
But yeah, when we think about, right, like why do people want to work for themselves or to do a kind of project or to write a book, right? It's because you want to do something that you haven't done before. And it's so easy for us. I think this is true. Well, I mean, I know this is true in any business space. Turns out there are schools where they teach you this. Weird. There are ways that we now believe are the defaults for how to do business that are passed down like sacred texts of themselves, right? Our business case studies and
the E-Myth.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Fucking hate that book.
So I also do not read any. I do not read any of that stuff at this point. Yeah. Every time I read something like that, I get so furious. I actually have thought about having a book club where we read those books and critique them, except then I was like, then you'd have to read them again. But like these terrible management books where like you assume that people are bad and like are gonna steal from you. I was like, this is bad. But
it would be like I could see like the hipster ironic book club where you just get together and drink Paps and like axe throw, and then you like ironically take lessons from the E-Myth into like your daily life.
I mean, maybe this is our first joint event. I'm just throwing it out there. But I think that we have to remember, especially in the online space, like the podcast and this and that, like none of that was a given. None of that was a given 20 years ago, right? And none of the ways about how people do things now were a given even a few years ago, right? I talk about this a lot from a strategic standpoint, but the primary lead generation drivers of kind of web 2.0 online education don't actually work all that well anymore, right? It's a whole other conversation, but like the companies that are extremely successful now were built off of cheap Facebook ad leads that don't exist anymore. It's not. So I love what you're talking about in the sense of recognizing how easy it is for us to get funneled into these spaces and forget, not just even to critique them, but forget to look outside. Forget that actually we're here, we're building things. So why can't we build different containers and build different ways of doing it? Like it's so silly. And I do the same thing, but so silly. I see all these entrepreneurs running around being like, oh, I have to do this because this is the thing. And I'm like, wait, what are we talking about? Like this, aren't you a builder? Make something new.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really wanted to ask you this question about identity. Like the identity of being, so this is very specific to being an online business. It's like you used, I think, charismatic founders, you use that like personality. I've been struggling with this because I want to do this for a long time, this being like a personality driven business. But like when I was 26, I was just blacking out trying to get laid in New York City. And now I'm a 44-year-old dad that like jogs to avoid drinking and listening to Rage Against the Machine at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. And so I'm just going to change and evolve. And I see kind of the opposite of like, you see it in like writing courses, which is just like very difficult space to observe from the outside. And like one day you're not going to want to talk about just writing. And so there's this kind of constant shedding of an identity, which you may or may not be in right now. You're definitely shedding the identity of being the founder of Holistic Business Academy. And how do you think of these like deaths and rebirths of identities? What do you like, there's the way you show the world, but there's also like internally how it feels to use Pema Chodron's world, like the groundlessness of it.
Oh, and And you mentioned that at the top, that you're kind of feeling this, been feeling unmoored, that groundlessness. I love that. I think there's a few things. I do think that, like most things, we can get used to that. Mm-hmm. We can become more comfortable with the discomfort. We can become more comfortable with the groundlessness, with the change. And I think that's a good thing. I work really hard to cultivate my ability to change. Mm-hmm. Humans tend to be pretty change resistant. We're really encouraged to be change resistant. It's risky. It's the kind of thing that threatens you from being in the in-group and all sorts of stuff, right? Yeah. And I think you talk about your meditation practice. I think that what a way to get uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Sitting there and watching your own thoughts. Ugh, it's so hard and terrible and great. So I work to maintain or grow this ability to change. So it has gotten a little easier with time. But I do think that, first of all, yes, 100%. My identity right now is I have no idea who I am anymore. I do and I don't. It's really hard, though, to shut down a big thing. And people are still like, oh, yeah, you did this big thing. And I was like, I did. And now everyone's like, what are you doing now? And I was like, working, writing a book, hanging out, petting my dog. I don't really know. I think there's a few things. The internet collapses time in a way which makes it feel like we should have solved these problems faster than I think anyone normal does. My product actually fully closed end of July. We're recording this in the middle of September. So there's I started the wind down at the end of March. That's when I told the clients into April, but July. So there is this, but I get it.
We're talking about it like it's 2-year ordeal, Right,
it's been 2 years, Sarah, since you've produced anything new. When are we going to get something?
By the way, and it was summer also.
It was summer. It was August, which I have learned the hard way is just not worth it for me. I never have good sales in August. So I actually took most of August off. But I think there's the time collapse. And it's so easy because we go online when we have something to share and people are always coming and sharing. And it's the part of identity collapse is not really shareable. It is. It's yes, it's I am running every morning and listening to Rage Against the Machine. It's you could write that, but it's not it's not content. It's not a lesson, right? But I think the other piece, and this is something that came up in a conversation with some clients, and I am so sorry because I cannot remember the person who said the thing that made me think of this. So apologies, client, if you are this person, let me know. But we were talking a little bit about this maneuverability, and someone mentioned musicians and how recording artists, right? And every album is a new project. And I was like, wait. Right, there are all these other fields where people are constantly reinventing in ways big and small. Artists, musicians. My old background is actually working in fashion. And I was like, right, you have seasons. There's a new show. There's a new thing. There's a new this. There's actually entire fields where it's really normal for a couple times a year or every few years to be someone completely new. Yeah. And I was like, but we still listen to them, right? And at some point you might be like, okay, that band 5 albums in is not who I liked initially, or whatever. But right, there's a model for this. It's just not in business where stability is graphed onto sameness.
Yeah. Oof. And it's funny, it kind of comes back to our Sebastian sells seashells about it. It's every 7 years there's this. I've come to accept that I don't think cause kind of my careers have kind of worked in these kind of 8-year chunks. And so it's kind of I feel like I'm in the start of this next string of 8, which will take me to fucking 52. My kids my eldest will be going to college when this next season is over. And yeah, I'm I do love the artist metaphor, not even metaphor. I think of, one-hit wonder, one album bands. I'm oh yeah, they they're still playing that same album 20 years later. I'm and again, it's not a critique on them. Some people want to drink Starbucks every morning because of the familiarity, right? Some people want to hear the greatest hits album every time because of the familiarity. And it's just it's a discernment in myself that's I need change. Things got to be different. And I think you said it at one point. It's is it coming from a place, paraphrasing, is it coming from a place of curiosity and creativity or a place of self-loathing and anger and escapism, right? It's like kind of like finding that right, making sure that the source of it is healthy.
And I wonder, you have kids, and this is probably, I mean, it's a little cliche to even say, but I think it's worth mentioning. Like, your children change all the time, right? And in fact, you hope they do, I believe. And is there some arbitrary date where you expect them to be fixed in time and space?
Yeah.
I mean, we're like, basically, we have all these markers where you're expected to change. I'm a high school student now. I'm in college now if you do that. Like, I'm getting married, and then it's all of a sudden you're just done. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like,
I think too that there's always this, because even I've written about this. I call it the magic window, where I'm still in it with my kids, where you're the center of their world. Although now there's Ariana Grande posters, and she's like puts her headphones on and like, I'm listening to SZA, like, leave me alone, Dad. But at the same time, it's not like the way I wrote it. It's like, oh, that window closes, and then they're like off with their homies, skateboarding and causing ruckus and TPing people's houses. It's like, no, like, we were in New York this summer, and my eldest, she's like turning into not a foodie, but a curious eater. And so everything is like, let's rank all the cookie places in New York. Right.
That's
and
so
I mean, that is so fun. And like, sure, she probably wants to hang out with her friends more than, all things considered. Like, if it was friends or dad, she would pick friends. But at the same time, she wants to go rank all the ramen places in New York City. Like, let's fucking go, So I do there again. It is this I keep actually coming back to the kind of crossfading DJ thing, where it's not this like cliff where it's like, oh no, your kid hates you, never wants to talk to you again. It's like, no, like, it's just the edges have changed, the texture has changed, but there's like this still kind of core thread that permeates. And I do think that for me, I have seen this core thread permeate. Like, I was, when I was in college, I would volunteer in in kindergartens. So I always liked kids, and I always liked teaching. But I was a computer science major. I worked on Wall Street. I knew web design. So I was like a very kind of not the type of person you would think would be in a school with young kids. And so it's kind of like, and even if I think of some of the group coaching programs that we run now, like, that is my form of teaching. I even view like my writing as a form. It's not necessarily teaching, but it's like a transfer. It's an exchange of wisdom, of knowledge, right, and information. So when you zoom out, the thread is like still very consistent, even though the containers like Wall Street to groundless K are completely unhinged.
Yeah. No, I think the threads are there. That's the benefit of being able to look back at time. And I think that when you start to notice what those things are, and I think maybe a few failures, a few burning of bridges and ships help you to really notice what those core things are that you carry forward. Yeah. I'm hopeful for you and me, and I actually have great faith that then we can start to more intentionally build around them, right? And bring those in these ways where the next thing, like the level of self-awareness that you're describing in terms of those threads is so much higher than I imagine it was when you started working online, right? Yeah. Like leaps and bounds.
Just like anything that scared me, I would just like drink to make, to like stop feeling it.
Stop it.
So it was just like a very, I know already I'm just like, wow, like, God, that was an unhealthy coping mechanism. So yeah, a lot of, and even a lot of numbing, both substances, but also just like more work and, beating your body up in a certain way, or, different, lots of numbing. Right. And I think that actually probably like closes another thread that we're talking about, where you're mentioning like needing so much self-care just to show up. I think that if you start to become aware of your numbers, then your self-care there's like an earnestness to your self-care, where before it was like this like very like aggressive pendulum. I'm gonna like get so fucking wasted this night, and then like I'm gonna call my masseuse, and like they're gonna come over and like put an IV in me and give me a massage, right? And then it becomes like, oh, like maybe I'll work out like really hard, and then I'm like go to my physical therapist, right? It's like the pendulum still swings, but it's not these like violent extremes.
Yes. Yeah, and I think the overwork one for me is a huge one, and you can start to notice, right? Like, okay, am I creating these situations? Am I continuing to engage in these situations that require all this extra support that maybe I don't have to, you know?
Yeah.
But that level of the numbing is such a huge piece of it. A whole other conversation we could have.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, so as we wrap, so walking. If you had to TLDR the walking away from good money, if you want to think about it, I can come up with my TLDR.
If it's making you miserable, it isn't good money.
Yeah. Ooh. TikTok right there.
You're welcome.
I'm not even gonna answer. That is just the mic drop.
There's your mic drop.
There is your mic drop. Like a true writer, a true salesperson, a true connoisseur of the human soul.
Now I have this image of myself going around with your daughter taste testing human souls, right?
Hey, we'll be in New York in December, so.
Can't wait.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. This has been so fun. One of the joys of this container is like, you can listen to someone's podcast, be like, this person sounds like we'd be friends. And you have your container. Come, let's be friends on my podcast. And we'll hang out when I'm in New York next or when you're next in LA. So tell our listeners where they can find you. We'll put everything in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I am Sarah M. Chappell all over the internet, more places than you would want to find me. But sarahmchappell.com is where you can find my writing, which is where I write a newsletter called Think Piece. That is a joke and also not a joke. And that's probably the best thing to check out if you're interested. Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Be back soon.